British gaming once ruled the gaming waves, but now it's just a ghost ship flying an American flag. So, what happened? Once upon a time, Britain stood shoulder to shoulder with Japan as one of the world's leading video game producing nations. From the bedrooms of teenage coders to the offices of revolutionary studios, British developers shaped genres, pushed technical limits, and delivered a uniquely eccentric creative voice that resonated around the world. Yet today, that same nation has been reduced to little more than an outsourcing destination for foreign conglomerates. Its developers embedded within projects that they do not own. Its studios working on intellectual properties they no longer control. Which begs the question, where did it all go so horribly wrong? This video is not about a dramatic toppling or an unexpected collapse. It's about slow erosion, a quiet, bureaucratic capitulation that saw one of gaming's most innovative ecosystems dismantled piece by piece. There was no hostile takeover, no corporate espionage, no sudden implosion. There was just a long series of poor choices. So, with all that said, join me today to hear the depressing and somewhat infuriating story of how British gaming didn't merely fall behind in the global industry, it lay down, opened the door, and let itself be killed. I am Lady Decade. If you like spicy gaming history, then hit subscribe, because this is how British gaming let America kill it. Most gamers at the end of the day don't care whether a game is made in Japan, Poland, Korea or on the moon. So as long as it's good, the studio's postcode doesn't matter nearly as much as the quality of what's on the screen. And that's why the French-made Expedition 33 has so many people excited. A stylish turn-based RPG made with actual vision and care. No committee, no cringe, just class. And if you're after something a little bit more action-packed, the Korean-made Stellar Blade has just come to PC. Yeah, really, that PlayStation poster girl is trading her DualSense for a mouse and a keyboard. Get 43% off Expedition 33, a massive discount on Stellar Blade, and up to 90% off of thousands of other games too by using my links below. Support the channel while grabbing real games for insane prices. It's a win-win all around. Well, except for the producers of AAA slop anyway. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's video. The foundations of Britain's video game industry were not laid in corporate boardrooms or state-funded labs, but in bedrooms by teenagers. In the early 1980s, home computers such as the ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro and Commodore 64 introduced affordable programmable technology to British homes on a previously unprecedented scale. For the first time, ordinary people could turn their curiosity into software and their bedrooms into studios. All they needed was a keyboard, a cassette deck and an unreasonable amount of ambition. What made this all the more special was that Britain was uniquely primed for this homegrown explosion. The BBC's Computer Literacy Programme, a state-led initiative launched in 1982, aimed to create a digitally fluent population, and it worked. Unlike in other countries where computing was seen as a vocational niche, in Britain coding became punk, a form of personal expression. There were no creative gatekeepers, no pitch decks, and no design committees, and the result was a national culture of experimentation, one that turned technical limitations into design signatures. And oh, those results were glorious. The games that emerged, Manic Miner, Jet Set Willy, Elite, Dizzy, weren't just commercial successes, they were expressions of British identity. Cheeky, surreal, inventive. These titles weren't derivative clones chasing trends from Japan or the US, they were trendsetters in their own right, pioneering genres like the open world sim and the narrative puzzle platformer. They weren't just selling software, they were making culture. From this 1980s coding renaissance emerged a wave of studios. Rare, Bullfrog, DMA Design, Codemasters, Psygnosis, who didn't just survive the system, they bypassed it entirely. They were fiercely independent, regionally proud, and gloriously strange. Their games were unlike anything coming out of Silicon Valley or Kyoto, and were being produced despite often being made by a boy in his bedroom coding on a potato. Miraculously, it was through those constraints that creativity came. Through independence came innovation, and through sheer, unrepeatable ingenuity, this would lay the foundation for Britain to earn its place as one of the world's most creative gaming nations. Not just a participant in global gaming, but one of its architects. No studio embodied that weird, wonderful ascent more than Rare. Founded by the Stamper brothers, Rare began life in the early 80s as Ultimate Play the Game, producing ZX Spectrum titles so visually ambitious they seemed to defy the hardware. By the early 90s, Rare had forged a legendary partnership with Nintendo, becoming one of the few Western studios entrusted to work directly on their systems. With Donkey Kong Country, Rare rewrote the rules of 16-bit graphics, pushing the SNES to its visual limits and proving that British ingenuity could outshine even Japan's biggest hitters. Then came GoldenEye 007, a project led by a group of largely untested developers that ended up defining the console first-person shooter. Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, Perfect Dark, Conker's Bad Fur Day, each one a cult classic, dripping with style, mechanical creativity, and a very British sense of humour. For a while, Rare wasn't just one of the greatest developers in the UK, they were one of the greatest developers, full stop. And Rare weren't alone. Britain had no shortage of visionary studios, each forging new genres and rewriting the rules before vanishing into the corporate churn. Take Argonaut Games. In the early 90s, this London-based studio achieved the unthinkable. They brought true 3D polygonal graphics to the Super Nintendo. Their pioneering work with Nintendo led to the development of the Super FX chip and, most famously, Star Fox, a technical marvel that proved 3D wasn't just the future of gaming, it was already here. Argonauts were more than just coders. They were hardware architects, designing chips and engines that pushed consoles beyond their limits. Their later titles, such as Croc, are often cited as video games that helped lay the foundations for 3D platformers as we know them. Then there was Psygnosis, the Liverpool-based powerhouse responsible for Lemmings, Wipeout, and the iconic owl logo that has been burned into every British gamer's memory. Psygnosis didn't just make games, they made cool. Their design sensibility, their futuristic visual style, their techno soundtrack curation. This was gaming as fashion, as club culture, as cultural rebellion. When Sony acquired them in 1993, it was partly to secure their technical know-how for the upcoming PlayStation, but also to tap into that uniquely British edge. Wipeout became a cornerstone of the PlayStation brand. During this period in the mid-1990s, the British video game industry stood at a technological and economic crossroads. The advent of 3D graphics, CD-ROM media, and the rise of the Sony PlayStation dramatically raised the financial and technical bar for game development. What had once been possible with small teams and modest budgets in the 8-bit and 16-bit eras now required dozens of staff, expensive new tools, and large-scale marketing campaigns. British studios, which had flourished in the low-cost, high-ingenuity environment of home computing, now found themselves increasingly outmatched by better capitalised rivals in the United States and Japan. Unable to finance the leap to cinematic presentation and extended production cycles, many British developers turned to foreign investment. These partnerships, however, often came at the expense of creative independence. In 1995, Electronic Arts acquired Bullfrog Productions, the studio behind Populous and Theme Park, with the promise of global distribution and financial stability, but over time, EA's corporate oversight diluted the experimental character of Bullfrog's output, introducing market-driven decision-making that increasingly clashed with the studio's creative instincts. Peter Molyneux, once a symbol of British design audacity, would eventually walk away, frustrated and marginalised within the very machine meant to support him. Core Design, the developers of Tomb Raider, were acquired by US Gold and later merged into Eidos Interactive. While the Tomb Raider series initially became a global success, the pressure to capitalise on the franchise led to rushed annual releases and internal burnout. Eventually, even Tomb Raider itself would be sold off, passing from British ownership into the hands of Japanese and then later Swedish holding companies, most recently Embracer Group. It's one of the clearest examples of a British IP being exported and culturally severed from its place of origin. Meanwhile, DMA Design, the creators of Grand Theft Auto, were acquired by Gremlin Interactive before being merged into Rockstar Games. Their evolution into Rockstar North would ultimately make them one of the most financially successful studios in history, but with creative and commercial control firmly shifted to New York. GTA 5 alone would generate over $8 billion in revenue, but almost none of that remained in Britain. Yes, the games were still developed here, but decisions about tone, direction, and long-term strategy were made overseas. Additionally, by 2000, Psygnosis had been renamed Studio Liverpool and integrated into Sony's global hierarchy. The British Cool had done its job. Now it could be repackaged and rebranded. In 2012, Sony shut down the studio entirely, and as for Argonaut, the studio quietly folded in 2004. No honours, no retrospectives, just another British pioneer erased from its own history. What a depressing state of affairs. During the early 2000s, even Rare, perhaps Britain's most prestigious and prolific studio at the time, began exploring external partnerships to remain competitive. After years of close collaboration with Nintendo, the Stampers opened the company up to outside acquisition. Microsoft would ultimately purchase Rare in 2002 for $375 million, marking the end of the studio's golden era of independent experimentation and the beginning of its long decline into irrelevance within the Xbox ecosystem. Rare still technically exists, but the creative soul that's made it so iconic is long gone. The stories follow the same tragic rhythm: brilliance, acquisition, dilution, disappearance. Each studio became a case study in how British innovations were bought, absorbed, and ultimately extinguished, not through failure, but through foreign success. They did everything right, and they still vanished. Some might argue that these were savvy business moves, that success meant adapting to the realities of a growing industry, but these weren't mergers of equals. These were sales of identity. British studios weren't becoming global players, they were becoming subsidiaries. And while economic reports may show that the UK games industry contributed £2.87 billion to GDP and employing tens of thousands of people, that headline growth masks the deeper truth: that much of that activity is now in the service of foreign IP, foreign shareholders, and foreign strategy. Britain was certainly still making games, but no longer owned what it's made. This period marked a fundamental shift in the identity of British game development. The raw invention, technical audacity, and regional eccentricity that had once defined the country's output gave way to increasingly homogenised, risk-averse design philosophies imported from American publishing models. Development pipelines became standardised, focus testing replaced instinct, and British studios were encouraged, if not required, to pursue global commercial appeal over cultural specificity or creative daring. And this is why you will never again get to experience a title like Conker's Bad Fur Day. The industry had not collapsed. It had stabilised, but it had also traded away its cultural sovereignty in return for security, and as would become increasingly apparent in the years to follow, the cost of that trade was far greater than anyone had anticipated. By the mid-2000s, corporate consolidation in the British gaming industry had reached a critical threshold. What began as financial partnerships and acquisitions in the previous decade had hardened into full-scale integration into American publishing empires. British studios were now repurposed to serve the strategic goals of multinational conglomerates headquartered thousands of miles away. Rare's fate in particular symbolised the era. The studio that was behind GoldenEye was expected to become a cornerstone of the Xbox ecosystem, but instead, Rare was gradually redirected away from inventive core titles and more towards peripheral development, first with Grabbed by the Ghoulies, then with Avatar design and eventually Kinect exclusive software. By the end of the decade, Rare had been reduced to producing motion-controlled sports minigames and dashboard cosmetics. The transformation wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a clear message. British creativity would now be subordinate to American commercial strategy. Now, this is the point where people often say, but Rare still made games, didn't they? And yes, They do, just not the kind that build legacies. They went from creating genre-defining experiences to building digital trinkets for a motion control gimmick. Their output didn't disappear, but their creative soul did. And Lionhead Studios followed a near-identical trajectory. Founded by Peter Molyneux after his departure from Bullfrog, Lionhead was acquired by Microsoft in 2006 amid great fanfare and promises of creative freedom. Yet, over time, that promise gave way to increasing corporate interference. Fable Legends, a live service multiplayer project that bore little resemblance to the studio's earlier work, was eventually cancelled. In 2016, Microsoft shut Lionhead down entirely. Peter Molyneux had obviously long since left, and one of the UK's most ambitious narrative studios was reduced to a historical footnote in Xbox's failed foray into service-based gaming. Here too, critics might argue that these deals gave British studios access to funding and global audiences. And that's true, but irrelevant. Access without authorship is not empowerment, and these studios became vessels for someone else's vision, tasked with executing strategies they no longer had a say in shaping. To put it simply, the funding came and the decision-making left, slowly killing everything that made British games so special. Meanwhile, Rockstar North, the Edinburgh-based studio behind Grand Theft Auto, remained physically in the UK, but creatively and commercially answered to its American parent company, Take-Two Interactive. Despite developing one of the most profitable entertainment franchises in human history, the British identity of the studio was gone. Even its British classification under the UK's cultural tax tests became a loophole, allowing billions in foreign profits to be routed for its British production credits without any real creative sovereignty attached. Codemasters, once known for its eccentric racing titles and budget brilliance, gradually became a factory for annualized Formula One games. By the time of its $1.2 billion acquisition by Electronic Arts in 2021, Codemasters had already been retooled into a cog in EA's sports publishing machine, with little room left for innovation like Rare, like Lionhead, and like so many others. It still existed, but only in name. At a glance, this era might still appear successful: globally recognised franchises, prestigious awards, and growing employment numbers. But look closer, and you'll see that the authorship was gone. British studios were no longer shaping trends, they were executing orders. This wasn't a partnership, this was an absorption. During this period, Britain ceased to be a nation of game creators and became a back office for the American games industry. Technically proficient, logistically efficient, and creatively marginal. The transition from independence to irrelevance was now complete, and for many of Britain's most iconic studios, there would be no return. In raw economic terms, the British video game industry has never appeared stronger. As of the 2020s, it is estimated to be worth over £7.8 billion, a figure often touted as proof of growth, success, and global relevance. And for many, this is where the conversation ends. See, they will argue, the industry is booming, what's the problem? But beneath that impressive headline number lies a deeper rot. More than half of all UK-based studios, 51.9%, are now foreign owned, with the overwhelming majority held by American publishers and investment groups. Britain may still be making games, but it doesn't own them. Profits are repatriated abroad. Intellectual property rights are held offshore. What remains in the UK is the labour, skilled, diligent, and increasingly invisible. The people are here, but the decisions are not. At this point, defenders of the current system often point to the UK's video games tax relief scheme, designed to support domestic development, but as always, the devil is in the details. Although the policy was introduced to boost homegrown creativity, 88% of all relief funds go to just a handful of companies, and most of them are foreign-owned multinationals. Rockstar North, for example, has claimed vast sums of tax relief, all while funneling billions in Grand Theft Auto 5 revenue to its American parent company, Take-Two Interactive. In theory, this is a subsidy for British innovation. In practice, it's a publicly funded rebate for offshore profits, all gift-wrapped by the British government, who are either too ignorant to notice or too spineless to care. As a result, the shift from cultural leadership to creative servitude is now complete. Where once Britain exported distinctive risk-taking games, it now exports services, quality assurance, localization, and porting. These are critical functions in any global development pipeline, but they offer no authorship, no prestige, and no seat at the table. No flagship AAA franchise is led, owned and creatively directed from within Britain. Even when UK-based teams contribute to global hits, their roles are often back office, subcontracted and shrouded in non-disclosure agreements. Obviously, you're going to get those who will still protest, but what about our indie game scene? Surely that proves British creativity is alive and well, and yeah, there are individual triumphs like Power Wash Simulator, Overcooked, Surgeon Simulator, clever and culturally resonant games that found international success, but these are exceptions. They're not indicators of systemic health. British indie developers operate without the level of state support found in France, Poland, or even Canada, where grants, incubators, and national funds exist to preserve cultural authorship and commercial independence. In the UK, there is no coordinated support network in place. There's no strategy and no safety net. But disgustingly, the cultural apathy runs even deeper. While countries like France and Poland elevate game developers to the status of artists and cultural ambassadors, Britain continues to treat video games as an adolescent indulgence. The BAFTA Games Awards receives a fraction of the media attention given to their film and television counterparts. The BBC's coverage of gaming is sparse and often framed around moral panic, addiction, monetization, or violence, rather than artistry, creativity, or cultural value. For a £7.8 billion industry, British games have astonishingly little cultural presence in their own country. What remains is an economic shell, commercially viable, technically productive, but spiritually hollow. The talent is here, the infrastructure exists, but the creative sovereignty and the right to decide what stories to tell and how is all gone. British gaming is profitable, but it's also a peripheral, anonymised, and perhaps worst of all, indifferent to its own disappearance. But disgustingly, the cultural apathy runs even deeper. What makes this all the more frustrating is that while Britain gradually allowed its gaming legacy to be dismantled, other countries responded to the rise of the global games industry with cultural intent and political strategy. France and Poland, in particular, chose to treat gaming not as a disposable consumer product, but as an expression of national identity and creative heritage, and the results speak for themselves. In France, the state has long recognised video games as cultural industry on par with cinema and literature. The country offers a generous 30% tax credit for games that meet cultural certification requirements, criteria that include the use of French language, European production teams, and thematically relevant content. These aren't just financial incentives, they're a framework for sovereignty. The policy ensures French studios retain not just jobs, but authorship, control over their stories, their style, and their success. Developers who qualify don't just receive funding, they are celebrated. They receive institutional support, public grants, and the kind of mainstream cultural recognition that's still reserved for filmmakers or authors in Britain. At this point, someone usually says, but the UK has tax relief too, and yeah, technically it does, but unlike France's model, which ties funding to cultural value, the UK's system is structurally agnostic. It offers no preference for British ownership, no protection for creative control, and no requirement that intellectual property remains on British soil. So the result is a system designed to be exploited. Rockstar North, for instance, as already mentioned, has received millions in UK tax subsidies while funneling its profits and creative leadership back to Take-Two Interactive in New York. It's public money funding private exports over in America. It's utterly despicable. Poland, meanwhile, took a different path but arrived at a similarly powerful result. There, game development is not just accepted, it's revered. CD Projekt Red, creators of the Witcher series, are treated as national icons. Developers at the studio have received state honours, their work is featured in tourism campaigns and in diplomatic outreach. The Witcher isn't just a game in Poland, it's a cultural artefact. Polish developers aren't dismissed as tech workers or overgrown hobbyists, they are respected public figures, authors of a modern national success story. And then there's Britain, where its most iconic creators are remembered less for what they built and more for how it ended. Peter Molyneux, once the mind behind Populous, Theme Park and Fable, is now more frequently mocked than honoured. His legacy is reduced to memified overpromises, not the pioneering spirit that helped shape decades of game design. The Stamper brothers, who turned Rare into one of the most beloved studios in the world, quietly disappeared from public life after Microsoft's acquisition stripped their studio of its identity. No knighthoods, no national tributes and no documentaries on BBC One, no equivalent of France's CNC or Poland's Ministry of Culture, just tax breaks for foreign corporations and institutional amnesia from the States. But before anyone says, well, the UK still has successful studios, yeah, it does, but they thrive despite the system, not because of it. There's no national strategy or policy to foster independence and no pride in its heritage. Only commercial celebration. Rewards for revenue, not reverence. In these contrasts, the lesson is clear. Britain did not lack talent, it lacked conviction. While France and Poland protected their creative industries with policy, pride and purpose, Britain handed out tax breaks with no strings attached, offered recognition without respect, and essentially let America stroll in, loot the vault and slap its flag on the roof and call it a partnership. Until Britain chooses to take gaming seriously, not just as a commercial venture, but as a cultural phenomenon, even its brightest stars will remain adrift. Profitable, but unrecognised. Global, but never truly British in the way that matters. So, what can we learn from all of this? Well, the sad truth is that the demise of Britain's gaming sovereignty wasn't inevitable. It was permitted gradually, knowingly, and with barely a whimper. While other nations developed strategies to protect and elevate their domestic industries, Britain stood idle, watching its legacy dissolve with polite indifference. And the reasons aren't mysterious. They're structural, cultural, and entirely self-inflicted. And in my opinion, there are factors at play which has led to this gaming nation suffering far more than others. First of all, there's our cultural snobbery. In Britain, games have never fully escaped the shadow of being seen as juvenile. Even now, they're treated more as vulgar amusements than legitimate cultural works. Japan elevates its game designers to the status of auteurs. But Britain still struggles to say with a straight face that games belong on the same cultural tier as literature or film. For those in positions of cultural influence, games are something children grow out of, not something grown adults create or analyse or celebrate. And this snobbery hits harder than ever here than it ever could in America, because unlike Britain, the United States actually takes pride in its cultural exports, however commercial they might be. Hollywood, comic books, jazz, video games are all recognised as part of the national identity, not in spite of their populist appeal, but because of it. In Britain, mass appeal is often seen as a disqualifier for cultural legitimacy. The more popular something becomes, the more gatekeepers turn up their noses. So while the US built institutions around its entertainment industries and elevated its creators to celebrity status, Britain quietly disowned its own pioneers, mocking the likes of Peter Molyneux, ignoring the Stamper brothers and acting as though global impact is somehow embarrassing if it came from a joystick and not a typewriter. Let's be honest here, in Britain, making a hit game gets you less respect than making a decent cup of tea. And this isn't new, it's rooted in Britain's oldest reflex, cultural cringe. For decades, Britain has undervalued its creative output until another country buys it. Rare wasn't mourned when it was sold to Microsoft, it was paraded as a success story. The message wasn't, we lost something vital, it was, look how much they paid. Time and again, foreign acquisition is framed not as a loss of sovereignty, but as a validation. Britain sees the check, not the cost. And the cost has always been long-term. Faced with rising development costs and a lack of national support, British studios consistently opted for early buyouts over long-term independence. At the centre of all of this is government apathy. No golden share protections to block foreign takeovers, no sovereign investment bodies, no institutions that are designed to preserve cultural IP. Cultural neglect, strategic passivity, financial short-sightedness. That's how British gaming died, not with a bang, but with paperwork. This wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a quiet surrender. No fight, no plan, no one at the wheel. Britain let America buy the house, redecorate it and hang up their own family portraits. And due to all of this, as of today, British gaming is directionless, underfunded and culturally unclaimed. And until that changes, we'll keep building other people's dreams while forgetting we once led our own. But if you're tired of playing corporate sludge and want to support the kind of artistry we used to celebrate, Expedition 33 and Stellar Blade are two recent standouts that prove games can still be bold, beautiful and built with actual vision. You can grab both at up to 43% off via my instant gaming links in the description and the pinned comment. Plus, there's up to 90% off of thousands of other quality titles. So if you're in the mood to play something great without funding another corporate merger, now is the time. See you soon.